My name is Ethan Tyrell. At about 9:30 p.m. on December 22nd, 2005, I left work at the used bookstore I manage and drove 10 miles back to the tiny house I was renting off a country road. When I went up to the front door, I saw immediately that the knob had been broken and someone had kicked the door in. I had to go inside the house to call the police because I didn't have a cell phone. When I got inside, I turned a light on to see if anything had been stolen. There was a little bit of mud on the carpet and something that looked like bits of burned paper, but no other visible evidence that someone had actually come inside after kicking the door in. As I was walking across the living room to the phone, I detected a faint smell that at first I didn't recognize. It was like the smell of apples mixed with a very sour, oak-like odor that got stronger as I stood there. When I realized what the smell was, I backed away from the phone, turned, and ran back out the front door. My house was secluded at the end of a long wooded drive, and as I ran through the dark, I was mortally aware of how close the woods were on either side of me. I knew in my gut that something might very well come out at me from them. But I made it onto the main road, and from there, it was a short run to the closest gas station. I settled myself when I got there and tried to remember the phone number I needed, but it didn't come to me. Deep in my wallet, I found a list of names and numbers, and it took me 3 calls to track down Linus Clegg. He didn't answer the phone when I called. I left him a message telling him the number of the payphone I was at and for him to call me immediately. I waited there for more than an hour. He finally called me back. He'd been out at a bar. There was very little recognition in Linus's voice, but that seemed calculated. It had been 9 years since we'd last seen each other, but he couldn't have possibly forgotten who I was. He was living in Rivieros, which was 40 miles north, but I convinced him to drive down and pick me up. He understood fairly quickly the danger we were now in. He had gotten much thinner in the past decade, and all his hair was gone, and he didn't look well. I got into his car, and we drove 1 mile to the local nursery. We sat there in his car in the dark for 2 hours, discussing what needed to be done. I had met Linus when I was 18, and we were serving almost identical sentences at a juvenile detention center. Both were for theft. Neither one of us was much of a criminal, but we both hated the world and wanted to do anything we could to scar it somehow. When Linus left the center a month after I got out, we met in a shopping mall and hung out for a little bit with no real purpose. As we were coming out of a movie, we were approached by a man with a long gray beard who told us he was looking to hire a couple of people to do some audio work for him, just holding a microphone for a few projects. He said he would pay us $200. Of course, we said yes. And that was when we began our involvement with David Espeth. The audio work was real. It was taping David at his house, reading for hours from a book written in Latin. He told us the book was about witchcraft. He sold the tapes by mail and claimed he eked out a living from doing it. There wasn't much valid point in involving us from the audio end of things. What he really wanted were 2 young people who were angry and desperate and gullible, and who would help him with his future experiments. That was me and Linus. David Espeth used us for 2.5 years. Over that time, he taught us a lot about witchcraft and gave us money and made us swear we would never tell anyone what we were doing. Of course, we couldn't keep quiet, and we did tell some other people, but none of them really believed us or paid much attention to us. About a year into knowing David, he told us to come over one night to videotape and audiotape one of his black masses. There was never anyone else involved in them. This one was more strange than we were ready for. He took us into the garage, and he showed us that he had a human skeleton in there, laid out on his workbench. It still had clothes on it. He had dug it up the night before. It was only partially rotted. There was still a lot of skin and hair on the body. It was a woman. From that point on, we helped David rob old graves in the middle of the night every month or so. He taught us all the finer points and techniques of how to do it. We knew it was abnormal and awful, but we were also fascinated by David. He seemed perfectly sane, but couldn't have been. Everything he did was completely unusual, and we liked the dangerous aspects of what he asked us to do. We videotaped him as he performed strange rituals with the skeletons. Sometimes he chopped them up and used just individual pieces of skeleton. His rituals were in Latin and English and French and some other language I never recognized. He wouldn't tell us much about what we were seeing. Soon we began to see that almost all of the money he made from the tapes came from the same 3 people. We kept seeing their names on the tapes that he sent out. All 3 of them lived in Germany. Near the end of the time we knew David, he started drawing up plans to dig up bodies that had been put into the earth only a few days before in heavily traveled cemeteries. He said there would be a lot of money in it because the rituals he wanted to perform were rare and no one dared do them but him. Sometimes, after a ritual, David would get physically sick and wouldn't be able to go out for days. He had us bring him groceries then, and he wouldn't even come out of his bedroom. Both Linus and I eventually matured enough to realize that David was slowly trying to seduce us into doing much darker things, and we decided we would stop going to his house. That was when Boris Dell, who was Linus's best friend, was killed in a motorcycle accident. I'd met him a few times. He sold marijuana to live, but he seemed like a good guy. Linus took his death really hard. After that, he seemed to forget that we had agreed to avoid David, and sometimes he went over there on his own, which neither one of us had ever done before. I went less and less, only when I really needed the money. By then we were both 17, and we had both moved out of our parents' houses. I had actually been kicked out. I was living in a group house and always needed cash. What I made waiting tables was never enough, so I couldn't fully break free of David's influence. One night, Linus told me on the phone that David had told him it was possible to bring his friend Boris back to life. I thought he'd gone insane. But David said he would prove it soon enough, and he would do this in return for an agreement from both of us to help him with some very advanced work with his rituals. I said I wouldn't help. I never had any more contact with David. But a week later, Linus came to see me and asked me if I could drive him to the cemetery where Boris was buried. He said he was feeling bad and just wanted to go over to the grave because he hadn't seen it. He hadn't gone to the funeral. He couldn't deal with it. Of course, it was a trick. We got there at dusk, and Linus said he needed my help to do something as soon as it got dark. He needed to bury a book behind Boris's tombstone. He said he'd give me $150 just to do this one thing. When I asked him why he couldn't do it himself, he said it needed to be done by someone who'd had no involvement in a ritual he and David had performed the night before. I said yes, that I'd do it, because I'd begun to become afraid of them both, and I told myself that this was the best way I could extricate myself from them permanently. I had decided that I would leave town the very next day and never come back. Until then, I would play along and not rouse any suspicion. So behind Boris's headstone, I buried a very old book Linus had brought from David's collection. I had to wait until full dark to do it. That was all that was required of me. I went to bed that night with all my things packed. I woke up before dawn and started to head out. I had no real idea where I was going. I stopped at the cemetery. I went back to Boris's headstone, and when it seemed safe, I dug up the 6 inches of earth I had buried the book in, and I took the thing with me. I put it into the car and I drove off. That night, I tried to read the entire book in a hotel room. Most of it was indecipherable to me because so much was in French and Latin. But David had made some notes in the back of it. The one I remembered most vividly was his note about how, when the dead rose, they carried a very specific smell with them. That smell had been very prominent around Boris's grave the morning I dug up the book. It was also there, even more strongly, when I went into my house on the night I came back from work to find my house had been broken into. I threw that book into a dumpster before I drove away from the motel. Linus and I sat in his car in the parking lot of the nursery on December 22nd, 2005, and I told him about that smell. There was no mistaking what it meant. I asked him to look me in the eye and tell me that he really thought it was possible that he and David had somehow brought Boris back from the dead. Linus told me point blank that not only was it possible, but that David had made videotapes years before of people he had brought back. And yes, sometimes it took years for the person to return. There was no telling why or when the person might appear. But Boris had not come back immediately after they'd made their attempt. They'd stolen his body from the funeral home and spent 24 hours locked inside David's house with it, performing their ritual. Long-term storage of the body was difficult and, of course, sick and illegal. About a month later, David had died of a heart attack in the aisle of a convenience store. Just like that. He had no family, and Linus had only found out about it after going over to his house a few times and not getting any answer to his knocking. A neighbor had to tell him what happened. There was a very short article in the newspaper about what sorts of things the police had found in the house. Boris's body was not mentioned. Linus described to me in a lot of detail what he had seen on the videotapes David had shown him. Linus told me that when he was 17, he thought they were real, and he still did. Now he wanted to see the physical evidence of Boris's return at my house. We drove there. When we got near the house, he said I should stay in the car and lock the doors. I didn't ask him why. We were quiet as I took the car up the dirt drive between the trees on my property. A branch that was hanging too low thumped against the passenger side window, and Linus jerked like he'd been shot. He told me to put my high beams on so he could see more. He looked all around before he got out of the car. He seemed to be checking the shadows for any shape that might possibly be something to be feared. He went up to the door and entered the house. I kept the engine running and turned the radio on and closed my eyes. I didn't like the way the headlights shone against the trees in the distance, which let me see just a few feet into the woods and no more. It made them seem more threatening. Just a minute later, Linus came out again and got back in the car and told me to drive us to the nearest motel. He said it was best if we spent the night someplace other than our houses. I was angry, but I complied when he told me he had more to explain. On the way to the motel, he told me that after David had died, he'd done his own research into the resurrection methods David had used. He claimed that was the last association he ever had with witchcraft. It took him 2 years to find out how dangerous the resurrection rites truly were if the slightest thing went wrong. What came back when someone was brought back to life could be something truly hideous to behold. It could be a thing with absolutely no intelligence that couldn't communicate but only breathe and exist. Something irredeemable. Linus said that if anything really had gone wrong with Boris's resurrection, there was a chance that what came back could harm us both. The fact that it had gone searching for me and somehow knew where I lived now was a terrible omen. Linus hadn't been back to his own house yet, and it wouldn't go back until daylight. I slept in the bed in the motel room while Linus stayed up in a chair and smoked and looked out the window onto the parking lot. I could barely sleep. Linus woke me at 4 a.m. He'd made a decision. He wanted to leave town for a while. He just needed to get a couple of things from his house. He asked me if I would go there with him first before he drove me back home. So once again, I found myself asked to do a final favor for him before we went our separate ways. This time I said no, but I reversed myself when I saw how truthful he was being when he said it was much safer if we were together when we went to his house. He was frightened for his life. We drove there and didn't say a word. He lived in a cheap modular home surrounded by a dozen others. It was in a state of total disrepair. The sky was beginning to lighten when we pulled up before it. Linus didn't get out of the car right away. I asked him what was wrong. He told me that he had lied to me. He confessed that it wasn't Boris who'd come back from the dead and entered my house. Boris was never going to return. They'd had to bury his corpse at a state park when they'd realized back then that they'd botched his resurrection badly. David was incapable of understanding what made one truly work. The videotapes he owned of other resurrected humans had all been made by one of his contacts in Germany. The man who had actually come back from the dead was David. He hadn't died of a heart attack a decade ago. That story had been invented by Linus, who had continued his association with him all along. They had been working together all this time, far more intensely than I could imagine. I asked Linus when exactly David had really died, and why Linus had chosen to try to bring him back. He said it hadn't been his idea at all. David must have arranged it with someone else, maybe one of the Germans. He had died just 2 nights ago. Linus knew this because he was the one who'd killed him. He had laced a glass of vodka with poison, and he'd watched David die. After that, he'd set fire to his house to destroy the body and any signs that he'd ever been there. He didn't tell me why he'd killed David, other than to say that the man had gotten too dangerous to completely innocent people. I started to figure out more when we went into Linus's house. Inside it looked like a museum of witchcraft. There was virtually no actual living space left. It had all been taken over by books, props, videotapes, audio tapes, all things having to do with the strain of witchcraft they'd been practicing for a decade. I didn't recognize any of the stuff. It all seemed far more advanced than anything I had encountered when working for David. If anyone but me stepped inside the house, their first thought would have been to call the police. I could imagine that if Linus and David had gotten deeper and deeper into that world, at some point a serious conflict might have arisen. Maybe it had become a fatal one. Judging by how badly Linus had aged in the past 9 years, he must have gotten trapped in vicious mental stress and been unable to get out of it. His life had been doomed almost from the beginning. So now Linus was a killer. But I followed him into his house because he seemed so lost and so scared. The first thing Linus did was take a handgun from his desk drawer. Then he went into his bedroom to put some things in a bag. While Linus was rummaging through his possessions, I couldn't help but take notice of a certain videotape that was labeled Alva Storcott. The name struck me instantly because it had been in the local papers for a while, years before. She was a woman who had been shot to death by the police as she tried to drive through a roadblock set up to stop her. In the back of her van were 4 terrified children she'd abducted that very afternoon. She was hopelessly insane. I lifted the tape and put it into the VCR next to the bookshelf. I turned the monitor on and pushed play. If Linus came up behind me, I didn't care. The image that popped up was a still shot of a dark enclosure. It was so dark I could make out almost no detail, but I heard David's reedy voice saying something to someone else. He was asking, "Where's the gas can?" After 10 seconds, an unseen hand turned on a bright floodlight, the kind that professional photographers use. Just before I heard Linus behind me asking what I was doing, I saw that the videotape was being shot inside a barn of some sort. The floodlight poured ugly white illumination over a wide patch of straw on the wooden floor. Lying on that patch of straw was a human figure wrapped in a sheet, one arm protruding. That was it. That was all I saw before I heard Linus's voice. I turned to him and we looked at each other, silently, for a moment. I hit the stop button and said nothing more. Neither did he. We started to go back out to his car. I was walking ahead of Linus as he locked his house. I saw that his hands were shaking. I stood at the passenger side door and waited for him. The neighborhood was totally quiet. The sun was beginning to rise over the mountains in the distance, but it was still dark in the driveway. As soon as I got to the car, I detected a faint smell of apples and oak. The terror that surged through my body was so strong and so powerful that it felt like an electrocution. I heard footsteps coming from my right. When I looked in that direction, I saw a shape standing in the tiny area of dying grass that was Linus's lawn. As soon as my eyes focused on the shape and I registered what I was looking at, it made a sudden movement toward Linus. It shambled quickly and jerkily in his direction. It was only 10 steps away or so, and by the time I shouted out to Linus, it was too late. He stared at the thing and almost seemed to let it come. The shape crashed into him, and the front door swung inwards, and they disappeared into the shadows. My nerve failed me then. By instinct, I wrenched the car door open and got in. I heard a grunting sound from the doorway and a muffled scream. I slid over to the driver's side and saw that there were no keys. Linus had them. Just before I got out of the car again and began to run away, I turned on the headlights. They threw light at the front door and into the house. I had to see what was there, just for a split second. In that second, I saw David Espith's corpse raising one hand into the air again and again, slashing at Linus's body beneath him. David's skin was blackened, and in many places it was simply gone. His legs were almost entirely bone, and the bottom half of his spinal cord was visible. He'd been obese in life, but the fire that Linus had set to destroy the evidence of the poisoning had reduced him to nothing more than a freakish stick figure. Some of the clothing had been permanently charred onto his bones, but the thing that used to be David was in constant, violent motion, as if he didn't understand that he wasn't alive anymore. Linus's screams were silent. I ran away from there, and I have never found out what the police and the neighbors discovered. I had a cab pick me up from a nearby McDonald's and take me north. And after that, no one ever came to ask me any questions. I refused to look at the newspapers or watch the news on TV. Whatever was found, I think that in another 3 or 4 months, all mention of it will be almost impossible to find or even stumble across accidentally. I'll probably be seeing the details of David's burned face in my sleep for the rest of my life. Even in the dark, I could see on the lawn that his eyes were completely gone, and there was almost no flesh on his skull. But I swear he still had a tongue, and it was moving inside his mouth when I ran from the car. He could have come for me, and he could still. What haunts me most, somehow, is the memory of how the smell of his resurrection had seemed to get stronger as I stood inside my house checking for signs of burglary a few hours before he slaughtered Linus. I think David was there when I was. Or maybe it was just fear and my imagination working to make me think that. I still work at the same job, but I've been commuting to it from 50 miles away. I'm living out of my car. I haven't been back to my house. At some point, maybe I'll be brave enough to go back there. But I don't know when that'll be. I just don't know.